So, first things first, what does geography have to do with food? What is the geography of food and eating anyway? Are we going to spend the next hour or so detailing where your carrots came from? Geography, as a discipline, is interested in the way problems are spatialized. Or, put another way, how do we humans interact with the space around us? This could be an Albertan potato farm, but it could also be our local supermarket. In fact, one of the tools geography gives us, quite like a dinner menu itself, structured from appetizer to dessert, is the ability to think about issues across scales. We can see the influence of policy, for example, at a local, municipal level, and we can zoom out and think about how these local sites link up and create a global scale. When we think through scales, we see globalization with its McDonald's and KFC outposts around the world, not simply as a global phenomenon, but a local one as well. As social scientists engaged in studying human interaction within material spaces, geographers are ready to read into the latest food trend and global interactions simultaneously unraveling on a given site. So when McDonald's comes to Moscow, for instance, geographers begin to look for the ways the globally ubiquitous golden arches are made part of a local setting. Geographers like myself, a legal geographer first and foremost, see the way global actors like McDonald's are domesticated into a Moscow street, not simply as an act of construction, but as an act of performance, where a multiplicity of actors work to make that place part of the city. In time, as Melissa Caldwell notes, local culture is continually invented and reified through its physical space and the social interactions those spaces permit. So geography gives us a way to talk about globalization, I think, renders more complexity and challenge into the world rather than just zooming out and removing detail. So I want to use geography's ability to situate issues and conflicts as a useful tool, a series of tools, really, to engage with the way we urbanites go about eating. Well, I'm not unique in my interest here. Geography has recently been quite interested in our patterns of consumption, spending, and eating. My interest in this topic begins, and I suspect like many of you, from the fact that I really enjoy eating food. In my academic life of studying people and places, I have come to find food as one of those elemental components to nature and society. Eating is something we all do. From what form it takes may vary greatly over generations and spaces, but the simple act of eating is a shared one. Still, even if food has become buzzy in academia and in the media, it's still a rather banal topic. Each of us puts food in our mouths every day with often little thought at all. And if we do think about it, our thoughts are more like an anxious inner monologue than a cogent contribution to public discourse. And I consider myself to be a geographer of the banal, of those interactions, actions, behaviors, processes that we do and take part in almost as instinct. Almost, but not quite. Our food system is made by a series of actions and performances repeatedly, day in and day out. So unraveling those threads a bit and assessing how we contribute to deciding what's on our dinner table is a matter of recognizing the actors and steps that are taken each day to keep those choices we make viable. What did we do before light butter? Whipped butter? Salted? Unsalted? Margarine? Lest we spend the afternoon in a fit of worry, it's important to keep in mind that eating and cultivating our sense of taste is, or can be, enjoyable. Unlike so many other narratives of self-care, eating is fun. Eating is implicated in our memories in ways that go well beyond the job of energy. Birthday cakes, homemade mac and cheese hot from the oven, a mountain of gyoza, or the seduction of pâté. Attached to each of these foods is emotion, perhaps pleasure, but I assume some of you are here because you enjoy food, and yet we find that our enjoyment is often at odds with our egalitarian hunches. It's these pangs of conflict between what's good and bad, good for us and good for a sustainable planet, that I want to worry through with you here today. I've subtitled this lecture, The Social Life of Taste, because I'm particularly interested in the processes through which food trends become a matter of identity, community formation, and environmental change. Why taste? Well, I want to argue that the means we go to in refining our taste and performing good taste has a geography of its own. SFU geographer Eugene McCann has taken up this phenomena, looking at the way policies travel from one urban center to another, what has become an offshoot of study in geography called urban policy mobilities. McCann and others within the policy mobility camp are interested in utilizing geography to think about the way ideas move. Urban policy mobilities begins from the assumption that ideas, concepts, and laws can move across spaces and scales. And I want to add food trends and taste to that list. McCann notes that cities and spaces are relational nodes constituted by the flows of capital, immigrants, information, etc., that tie them together to distant places. Place is, in this conception, an event, the coming together of the previously unrelated, a constellation of processes rather than a static thing, open and internally multiple. And taste, like the best practices in urban design or in health policy, circulates. And it's that circulation from a hazy new idea to a codified best practice that's useful to consider when it comes to the way we eat. For one, our eating has changed drastically in the last 50 years, and sometimes it's as if no one noticed. A quick scan of cookbooks from the 50s will reveal some tastes we've abandoned with the times. Ham salad or clam dip, anyone? Where did the South Beach diet come from, and how did flax move from a little-known seed to a smoothie must-have? These are the kinds of questions geographers are after when we consider the mobility of ideas, trends, policies, and tastes. It's the social geography of marks of good taste that I want to talk about, especially as they are precariously held up by a global food system neither ethical nor responsive enough to track these changes carefully. As for what taste is, well, that may be a topic for another lecture. The philosopher Edmund Burke penned an entire treatise on taste while conceding early on that he had no great opinion of a definition. But to cut Burke some slack, and here's the important point, he noted that to define would seem in danger of circumscribing nature within the bounds of our own notions. So taste is not just bigger than us, it remains a circular logic created by us. For however slippery the definition, taste is powerful. My argument here today is that taste has a distinct social power. And when we consider its influence across geographic settings and scales, from the home to the farmer's market to the nation state, we are unpacking the way we contribute to a larger food landscape, or as geographers Michael Goodman, Damien May, and Lewis Holloway call it, a foodscape. I am particularly interested in taste because it underscores our role as consumers within the foodscape. While much has been researched and said about production, I am more interested today in the nuanced social quirks motivating the way we shop and eat. In this way, I hope this is a conversation with some actionable ends. I'm not proposing unwieldy changes to food production, but rather that we as consumers recognize our culpability and place within the current, however deficient, food system. What does it mean to have good taste? Where does one acquire good taste? And is good taste aligned with things that actually taste good? Taste is a useful concept to think through this foodscape because it begins with those simple divisions of good and bad. There are things that are good for you and things of a more specious health benefit. There are things that are good for you, and still there are other things that may not be so good for us. PepsiCo, the world's largest snack food corporation, dubs their flagship soda and these Doritos as fun for you. And fun is good, but ostensibly not as good for you as the oatmeal and juices the company includes in its growing good-for-you portfolio. But of course, goodness is relative. And so we perform good eating, ethical eating, you might say, as we shop, prepare, serve, and eat with a relative attention to our body and to another, be that the farmer who picked our potatoes or the McDonald's line cook who fried them. Fair trade, for instance, has picked up steam as a food movement and quasi-brand for the way we consumers are connected to exploited farmers and laborers. Here, our goodness is both relative and performed in our care for and toward the disadvantaged. A visit to the website for Fair Trade International, the umbrella organization representing 25 fair trade labels, is peppered with photos of impoverished workers, tattered clothes, and wrinkled faces. No doubt, after all, that fair trade chocolate milk is not any more good for you than the mainstream options, but good taste comes in many forms. With increasingly energy recently, alternative food systems, where fair trade joins organic, slow, and a myriad of other labels and appellations, has not simply become more popular, but more attractive as well. The politics of what gets called fair trade, or even more confusingly what gets called organic, though, should make us think twice about buying into these markers of good taste and instead finding other ways to channel our social justice tendencies and ethical beliefs. Fair Trade International maintains the guidelines for the use of the fair trade logo, but the term itself is fair game. Still, other permutations of fair, ethical, sustainable pop up on packages mimicking the spirit of the fair trade certification. Now, fair trade refers specifically to the labor conditions and minimum wages paid to those who are involved in raw resource extraction. Cane sugar, coffee, flour, tea, all have fair trade options on the shelves today. But consumers need to be more critical when coming across fair trade bath products or snack foods, where it's unlikely that every ingredient has been negotiated to a fair trade standard. And if you've ever bought fair trade products in the US, still the world's largest consumer of fair trade products, it hasn't met what few guidelines Fair Trade International has for certification. That's because the US doesn't cooperate in the 25-country certification program, so fair or ethical products we buy from the US or that are produced or packaged in the US have not met any certification standard. Back in Canada, fair trade certification has become a gateway certifier to the US market, and still expanding to move beyond food and raw products altogether. You may have noticed the buzz a month ago when SFU became the second university in Canada to be certified fair trade. The title itself reflects the way food trends have shifted over space and time. When SFU opened its doors atop Burnaby Mountain in 1965, a hamburger was a scarce find. And while students today may still lament their dining options, they pooled their collective influence to push administrators for fair trade dining exclusively. That fair trade came to the second largest university in British Columbia before Starbucks did reflects the power of taste and the fair trade movement in Canada. But don't worry, Starbucks is opening this fall. Similarly caught between politics and profits is the term organic, which has hit shelves in the last decade in an opportunistic frenzy. In fact, Fair Trade International estimates that over 75% of its products bearing a fair trade seal also bear some kind of organic distinction. The development and implementation of a federal organic labeling program in the US, again, has had a big effect on the way that term is taken up by Canadians. And not surprisingly, there is still, despite the bureaucracy on both sides of the border, not much clarity on how the term organic gets used. The United States Department of Agriculture developed its organic standards not as part of the agency's regulatory work, but under its marketing services. The Agricultural Marketing Service developed organic labeling then not as a policy, but as a marketing arrangement. Whatever regulatory oversight the USDA had traditionally brought to farming in the United States was not to be brought to the creation of an organic label. From a spineless corner then of the United States Department of Agriculture, the National Organic Program was established. But the work of oversight and certification was quickly jettisoned to third parties. Now, today, in the US and Canada, products are certified organic not by the federal government, but by third-party companies that do the certification work on behalf of the government. So that product that bears the USDA Organic or Canadian Food Inspection Agency organic logo has not been verified by either agency as organic food. To make matters worse, a product needn't be fully organic, just mostly organic to earn the seal. Not surprisingly, the Organic Trade Association of Canada found in a 2008 review that hundreds of products on its shelves were incorrectly or falsely using the term organic. Confusing, really, but that's kind of the point. Not everything that says organic is actually organic, and all that ignores what value eating organically may or may not have for our own ethics and health. Organics have quickly become a booming business worth over $26 billion in the US alone. And some of the fastest growing areas, according to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, for the organic food label may be a bit of a head scratcher. Icing products, soup, baby food, cereal, and vinegars. No telling what the organic quality distinction is on vinegar, but that hasn't stopped consumers from buying in. With chains like Whole Foods to trumpet the cause, alternative eating has moved to the mainstream. For a sizable upcharge in your grocery bill, yielding the moniker whole paycheck, you can switch, often right on the same block in Vancouver, from a traditional grocery store to a Whole Foods, epitomizing the healthfulness and good taste that comes with ethical eating. Popular food pundit Michael Pollan has called shopping at Whole Foods a literary experience, where evocative prose elevates an egg or a chicken breast into a much headier experience. Amidst the explosive popularity of organics and alternative eating, stores like Whole Foods have begun serving up what Pollan calls storied food. Food served up with elaborate narratives about where it's from, how it's been raised, and how it made it to your local store's shelf. The copywriting turning up at Whole Foods is at once complicated and aspirational. Such elaborate stories must translate to better taste, right? Like the rotisserie chicken Pollan picked up, Rosie, a sustainably farmed free-range chicken from Petaluma Poultry, a company whose farming methods strive to create harmonious relationships in nature, sustaining the health of all creatures and the natural world. These nuanced and lofty narratives may signal better taste, but they also signal our vulnerabilities and insecurities at the supermarket. With more doubt about the industrial food system, these stories serve as a way of reassuring us that what we're buying or buying into is delicious, fresh, and nutritious. But all this wordplay is its own funny cautionary tale. The hilarious and often contradictory prose served as comic fodder for two earnest diners on the U.S. television show Portlandia, who wanted to know if the chicken on a restaurant's menu was organic, fair trade, free range, and what the chicken was fed. When a waitress returns, she offers up that the bird on the menu is in fact organic, free range, and was named Colin. We're left wondering, is our consumption and the guilt around being good consumers being sold off with carefully penned stories? Beyond the fancy writing, whole food stores utilize green imagery and make use of terms like whole and natural, original, organic, sustainable, ethical, and local, though none of these terms is applied with any kind of exacting precision. Instead, the words, the pictures in the store, serve to create a consumer buy-in that we're doing good, if not for our bodies, then at least for society. And at first glance, that seems to be so. Whole Foods, for instance, doesn't carry either Coca-Cola or Pepsi, but does carry bottled water produced by both companies and smoothies from a PepsiCo subsidiary, Naked Juice. Incidentally, the Pepsi-Naked connection represents but one corner of the way a few major conglomerates have come to control our eating and spending. The food marketing landscape looks less like unique visionaries and alternatives, and instead a complicated web of brands owned by bigger multinational corporations like this. Sure, our vitamin water is owned by a company that's owned by Coca-Cola, but how many of you realize that a company behind Pringles was also making your CoverGirl cosmetics? Back at Whole Foods, the Mighty Mango Juice and similar products offered by Naked are among those that appear to be organic, but trade on terms like ethical and natural to circumvent guidelines. If you had any desire to lower your carbon footprint, ostensibly one of the reasons people buy organic items in the first place, this juice wouldn't get you very far. Trucked in from California, it sent more emissions out of the back of a tailpipe than most conventionally grown mangoes. Still, that'd be hard to figure out at first glance. Naked, like many others in Whole Foods, boasts a whole series of certifications, including LEED Gold, which honors building standards, not juice. But it's natural, which sounds good. And yet again, upon closer inspection, we find that a smoothie, branded as Naked, pure, and simple, contains 60 grams of sugar in a single bottle. 1/4 of your day's sugar intake in a few, however, natural gulps. There is fancy packaging, of course, and I'm not here to denigrate a well-designed package. I'm a sucker for beautiful wrapping and labels. But all of these alternative selections come at a price, the idea being, or so we're told, that these more expensive costs more directly align with what we should actually be paying in the first place. The expensive alternatives reflect a purported real production cost, and so goodness here gets wrapped up in a kind of truth in advertising. And the cheap stuff, on the other hand, gets waved aside as bad. Bad for the environment, bad for our bodies, bad for our ethics. One need only think of a scene of Super Size Me for an example. But as University of California, Santa Cruz professor Julie Guthman notes, ethical and alternative eating is deeply mired in its own set of contradictions that should make these good and bad distinctions pointless. She notes, most importantly, to posit one assemblage as unwaveringly good and the other as altogether bad depoliticizes a potentially powerful politics of consumption. Little is it considered that organic production depends on the same systems of marginalized labor as does fast food, or that organic salad mix led the way in convenience packaging and is often grown out of place and out of season, or that fast food serves women who work outside of the home who are then blamed for depending on it to manage family and work, or that slow food presumes a tremendous amount of unpaid feminized labor. Restaurants serve up their own contradictions. How else to explain the high-end restaurant that serves organic mescaline and foie gras? The well-paid artisan cook working in tandem with the undocumented migrant busboy. If the political importance of organic food and slow food is attention to the labor processes and ecologies by which food is produced, it is imperative to make sure these valorized alternatives reflect alternative values. In all of these mainstreaming of alternative food choices, where grocery stores and fast food chains alike are competing to convince us of their goodness, there is a need to actually step back and consider what role shopping, spending, and consuming have in doing good and feeling good, and to what extent these products and purchases allow us to shift blame while still being embedded in the capitalist program, a guilt offsetting program, if you will. Where ethical becomes a catchphrase and a trademark, the question of ethical eating itself becomes tangled in a whole series of contradictions. Much of the commercialization of alternative food systems, the work of making good choices easy and accessible at the supermarket, is done by obfuscating how that food actually reaches our table. It is this buying and eating that Professor Warren Belasco sees as socially safe consumption, where massive challenges to the inefficiencies of our food system are circumvented through effective marketing, avoiding significant reforms. So where do we find good taste? And what are the costs, be that social or environmental, associated with that sophistication? It seems at once that we find goodness and, in a way, easily bought signs of good taste popping up everywhere. The labels at the supermarket have grown more elaborate, but that doesn't mean that the food we eat is any more nutritious. Caught in between profits and policy, most food packaging today is stuffed not with nutrients, but big claims and buzzwords like light, lean, no calorie, low calorie, non-fat, low fat, fat-free, no sugar, sugar-free, 0 calorie, joining a host of ethical commitments, fair trade, slow, free range, and diet fads. Good taste, it seems, is for sale, though I would argue we've purchased it expired and with a coupon. So we find good taste is often hiding out as being smart, being a savvy shopper who balances those savage desires for tastefulness with the more sensible and reasonable discernments of nutrition and ethics. We're taught not to be gluttonous, to exhibit moderation. So buying the light mayonnaise and the reduced fat potato chips become not simply decisions about health, but decisions about how to have it all. And they say, or they feebly attempt to say to the rest of us, I get it. I can make smart decisions for my body and enjoy delicious food. Much as the fair trade and organic shopper signal to us an ethical sophistication, the shopper whose cart is loaded with quasi-diet renditions of guilty pleasures signals another kind of good taste. In both cases, the ethical shopper or the nutrition shopper, we are still being misled into labels and appearances of natural and fresh that traffic on perceptions of our own ability to do good as shoppers. In one case, we believe our consumerism can be channeled to solve ethical dilemmas, such as equitable wages in world labor markets or global climate change, while in the other example, we imagine our purchasing power can directly do good work to our personal health and wellness, or cheat death. Much as the organic product shipped across global supply chains does not reduce carbon footprints, neither does the reduced fat potato chip look to be the solution to obesity. To me, eating good taste is about eating tasty food. Coincidentally, eating locally provides for fresh and tasty eating naturally. But eating locally is hard, in part, as I'll discuss here, because most of what's made locally is exported and our markets then overrun with imports. Still, eating locally is hard because of the politics and economics around commercial farming, which have made small-scale production unfeasible and connected a diffuse network of farmers across North America together in a massive operation to fuel our urge for a Big Mac and fries. And as local eating itself takes on a buzzworthy status in the consumer landscape, it's important to consider where our food is going, what gets called local, and what premium pricing is associated with keeping our local produce closer to home. This, in theory, shouldn't be so challenging. We live in an area with rich resources, so at some level, access to fresh and local food should be a no-brainer. But as I think we'll see, local eating is structured by an elaborate series of policies and choices, some that we make, and to be fair, some are made in Ottawa and Washington. And local eating has been replaced, historically, with fresh eating, but the two are not the same. I'm interested in local eating because of the tastiness of the food and the spatial awareness we get for eating foods grown close by. When food is quickly moved from cultivation to extraction to table, it's undoubtedly fresh and needs no further label or packaging to prove it. Importantly, for a geographer, local food delivers a sense of citizenship. It connects us to our home. Eating food from here allows us to invest in what developing here actually is, what it means to be a part of the fantastic experiment called the city. And so here is but another reason to look upon canned food drives with a degree of skepticism and lament. Local, fresh, tasty food ought to be available. If you do manage to get to a farmer's market or a cooperative society, you'll find that eating locally and seasonally can be cheaper than feeding a family of 4 fast food. But my employer, like many others, rolled out the collection bins this fall, asking us to send the lowest quality of foodstuffs to the city's socioeconomically disadvantaged. At a series of talks in the fall at SFU Woodward, several community activists bemoaned the deluge of cans and the challenges it poses for nutrition and public health within communities such as the downtown east side. And that is undoubtedly true. The cans of soup, pasta, and meat that are tossed in the bins are loaded with salt and preservatives to keep these foods miraculously fresh. But those cans do another kind of violent act. They render local eating and knowing where you live, to be a luxury commodity, reserved for those who can drive into Whole Foods, not for those who queue in lines. So as urban dwellers, it's easy to lose spatial context. But as Vancouverites, we're reminded, both in sprawling vistas from offices and apartments and in conversation, that there are mountains, orchards, rivers, farms, valleys, and fisheries just beyond our feet. And that rich landscape produces a distinctly tasty bounty of food to call ours. Calling it ours, though, would seem to be easier said than done. While local food is abundant, so too does it become unevenly available, tasted, and consumed. And for me, this is a problem. I suspect for some of you as well. You instinctively recognize the link between knowing where your food comes from and having a sense of place, feeling at home here in the Lower Mainland. And if you've tasted a BC spot prawn during that too short of a season, you know the fleeting and real tasteful joys of the food our area can provide us. So this is a question of access, and with access, civic knowledge. Is the good food easily found, easily obtained, and priced in such a way as to encourage widespread adoption? Does local eating figure into the legislation or production of the foods we buy and eat? Or has goodness been rendered a commercial end in upchargeable quality? Even worse, how have the big taste makers, the companies whose foods line our pantry, harnessed the vocabulary of fresh and good to drive profit? In order to work through the challenges behind eating good and eating locally, I want to look at a few crops and understand a bit further their particular geographies. For when we investigate how our food circulates, we begin to see the institutionalized inefficiencies within our food system. What happens to the corn or apples or spot prawns, for instance, after they're farmed? And what choices have been made in their cultivation that affect how they're purchased and consumed? So let's talk about corn. Corn is the most subsidized crop in the United States, with federal subsidies totaling over $77 billion between 1995 and 2010. The United States is the world's largest producer of corn, with the USDA counting over 400,000 farmers growing across 95 million acres. And of all of that corn, you might be wondering how much of it makes it to our table as this stuff. Yellow, delicious kernels, corn on the cob. Less than 1% of all the corn grown in the United States is actually grown as sweet corn or corn on the cob. So where's the rest of it going? What is being done with all that acreage across the United States dedicated to one crop that apparently none of us are eating or think we're eating? So that corn has to go somewhere. Some of that corn is behind the green fuel boom, spurred on by rising gas prices. So corn is figured into products like ethanol and E85, which helps account for at least some of those aggressive government subsidies that corn farmers get. Still, plenty more of it does end up in food, though you wouldn't know it, and it certainly doesn't look anything like corn on the cob when it reaches us. As scientists at the University of Hawaii discovered, corn, and in particular that cheap, plentiful corn found in the United States, has been a key ingredient to driving down the costs of your favorite value meals. When the researchers tested 160 items from Wendy's, for instance, French fries, hamburgers, chicken breast, everything, without exception, could be traced back to corn. That ubiquitous cheap corn is ending up everywhere, in a low-cost feed for cattle, sweetening ketchup as corn syrup, and plumping up the premature chickens being brought to market. Not only is this a process veiled from public scrutiny, but when the researchers tested chicken, beef, and French fries across the United States, they found no geographic difference with the composition of our Happy Meals. Under a microscope, the hamburger patty in San Francisco looked like the same patty in Detroit. We all, as it turns out, are eating precisely the same food that seems to have no distinct geographic appellation to it. Buttressed by cheap corn as a filler, sweetener, and feed, we've managed to push past the geographic differences between winter in California and winter in Michigan. And so in the quest to know where our food comes from, we find ourselves caught trying to understand where our food is going in the first place. So let's think locally about a food grown in our backyard. The apple has risen to become one of BC's biggest exports, and the marketing of BC tree fruits have made our Okanagan apples, pears, and cherries known far and wide, accounting now for roughly a quarter of all Canadian apples exported throughout the world. Yet, the apples ending up on our store shelves are overwhelmingly from somewhere else, usually from Washington State. The BC Ministry of Agriculture estimates that in a given year, BC imports over 115% more apples and pears than it exports. So for every apple going out of BC, another one comes right back in. And yet, the US, still the world's largest producer of tree fruits by acreage, our smaller, more artisanal collective of growers in BC has to compete on pricing and stay viable in the market. Not surprisingly, the BC and Canadian market writ large are deluged with cheaper apples from the US. In a food system that prizes economy, our relatively small apple industry cannot compete. Those of you who lined up this spring for spot prawns understand the volatility of supply, demand, and pricing around a local commodity. Undoubtedly, BC spot prawns are delicious. If you've had one, you know it's a special gift of spring. A short 8-week season brings to our shores a rare treat, a uniquely long prawn with a distinctive sweet flavor. And if you've seen the lines in recent years for the BC Spot Prawn Festival, you're witnessing a rare turnaround in our buying and eating. Less than a decade ago, the best spot prawns caught along the BC coast, roughly 90% of the entire season's catch, ended up on boats to Asia, where demand continues to be outrageously high today, still, for our local delicacy. Rather than try to negotiate locally, farmers sent their catch to Asian markets where they could easily fetch in excess of $30 a kilo for these prawns. That's when local restaurateurs and chefs attempted to reverse course and have negotiated competitive prices and driven high demand for the spot prawn. Today, hundreds queue up at the docks in Granville Island for a chance to take a few home. Still at roughly $26 a kilo at the docks in Vancouver, many more prawns are now staying closer to home, but demand, particularly across the Pacific, continues to press on farmers who are trying to make the most of a short season. So underlying all of this massive agriculture, our supermarkets today, and indeed the city itself, is one technology that has changed the geography of food and our relationship to it: the refrigerator. We have changed as a society from boasting about the global breadth of our menus to prizing local. All the while, what's coursing through it, as Susan Friedberg notes, an obsession with freshness. The conspicuous consumption of freshness didn't just reflect social hierarchies, it could also help keep them intact. In many societies, community-run feasts of first-run salmon, slaughtered bulls, and game meat reinforced the authority of chiefs and feudal lords. Leaders couldn't stop these foods from spoiling, but they could control their distribution while they were fresh. Of course, the refrigerator sought to change all this, and for a while it did. Fresh and good taste needn't be locally sourced. In fact, with the introduction of refrigeration, harnessing of technology to fold up borders was its own kind of social power. Today, the refrigerator has changed our sense of place and time in powerful ways. It means that eating seasonally or eating locally is no longer necessary. Fresh watermelon can be found in February, brought to us via refrigerated boats and trucks, quickly shelved in climate-controlled stores before it's taken home, kept fresh in our fridge. Beyond our food, our refrigerators have changed our cities. The restaurants and supermarkets, surely, but in the most basic and elemental way, the city runs on fresh food being brought in from the neighboring farms. And so with refrigerators comes the possibility for impressive population growth on the ground and profit growth for producers and retailers who could keep food fresh and reach this large urban population. And no one understood this and the business possibilities of refrigeration quite like H.P. Hood. In 1948, the Boston milk tycoon was expanding his business down to New York City, shipping product from New England via refrigerated rail cars to New York. Hood's plan hit a roadblock when officials in New York refused to grant him a license to sell milk, fearing Hood's new refrigerated trains would diminish the local supply of milk and reduce competition. Hood took his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and won, making his refrigerated milk car a catalyst for changes to come in the urban food landscape. While we don't get our milk by train anymore, there's no doubting the way inventions like Hood's have changed what we imagine eating in a city like Vancouver. Importantly, over time, refrigerators have changed to what we imagine is possible from our food. How long should a tomato be red and ripe? Like the loud labeling in the middle aisles of a grocery store, the produce section has been overrun by vivid, bright imposters filling in for the fresher, more nutritious versions of our fruits and vegetables, where fresh used to suggest an impermanence. Today, pre-cut salad in specially designed Ziploc bags seems to stay fresh, or looks fresh, for longer and longer. I say looks because researchers at the University of California have proven what many of us who've sliced into a beautiful-looking tomato only to find a mealy mush inside already knew. Today's produce can look better longer, but lose its flavor and nutrients quicker. All of this has changed our perception of fresh. from a measurement of time to a measurement of appearance. No longer is the mushroom fresh within X number of days, but by glances through Ziploc bags and Tupperware containers. And as refrigerators push the limits of keeping up appearances, so too do they sell us short on the vitamins, nutrients, and the taste of the produce of yesteryear. All of our anxiety around freshness reminds us, though, that eating is emotional and that shopping and cooking and eating are implicated in a web of memories from our upbringing. And it is here, I think, that where we actually develop our good taste in the first place. Eating is emotional, after all, and there is a social currency attached to it. Memories forged around meals, food serves as an important language through which friends, family, and colleagues come together and important events are consecrated and celebrated. And so food and eating is then implicated in our most intimate of relationships, with ourselves. Sure, we justify good taste by some relational qualities, but food goes into our bodies, and so the act of tasting at its most base is incredibly personal and wonderfully intimate, which makes our relative defensiveness of good taste all the more a spirited affair, because we're not simply debating the merits of Jell-O. We're talking to the way Jell-O is implicated in our earliest childhood barbecue memories. Add to all this that eating is, I think, fun, or that it can be. So beyond all the politics and packaging, there's this thing we do, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, sometimes over white tablecloths in Gastown, other times out of a wrapper on the SkyTrain, and it is filled with the kinds of enjoyable interplays between what we taste and how we feel. Good taste, you see, is incredibly emotional, and our good taste is crafted over years of consuming and eating and hopefully enjoying along the way. And I think we forget this, the way certain flavors strike a chord or jog a memory. To forget food's emotional currency, as so many pundits would have us do, seems disingenuous. It seems to ignore the way food is right there, for better or worse, as a corollary to the major events of our lives. Just as we eat to connect ourselves to distant and diverse homes, we eat knowing that food communicates in more than one register. And often this means we end up eating foods that may not be so good for us, but trigger memories and emotions. A guilty pleasure. Everything about a guilty pleasure is clandestine, prepared in the anonymity of a dark kitchen, eating in the privacy of one's home, or in my case, eaten surreptitiously in a corner of Save on Meats. So what's guilty about it? Well, there's the good taste of the food, and then there's its badness. And it can be all kinds of bad. Fast food that fuels a cheap corn frenzy, shark tail soup that threatens an entire species, or a greasy bag of Doritos, not an organic, ethical, fair, fat-free, low-fat, natural fiber in its being. And I end on this note because it's the emotional politics of eating that is ultimately the most important and shapes much of the decisions we make. And while I, too, am emotional and downright passionate about my favorite foods and guilty pleasures, we need as well to inject a modicum of measured discipline and good judgment into the way we shop. Companies and even governments cannot, it seems, be counted on to do the ethical or healthful work for us. We can't expect lawmakers or CEOs to bring to the supermarket our shopping list, our interests, our values, and our needs. Nor should we settle for local food that is trucked in, organic food flown halfway around the world, and a host of labels that are contradictory at best and deceptive at worst. Vancouverites have become attuned to the challenges in the way their food is produced, and this has fostered many spirited dialogues about urban gardening, mobile abattoirs, and of course the latest buzz of canning. And production is important, but we need to center the conversation back on ourselves as shoppers and eaters to decide if ethics, health, sustainability, wellness, and justice can simply be shopped for, or if we need to ask better questions of our grocers, vendors, producers, and lawmakers to allow each of us to make more informed and discerning choices about what we eat and how we spend our money. Thank you. And I think it's question time.
Do you have any comments on vegetarian products, mostly soy-based?
What about it specifically?
Well, the vegetarian meats, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's been explosive alongside a lot of these alternative food systems, whether it's organic or ethical or sustainable. Soy cheese and textured vegetable proteins have certainly grown in popularity. As far as the nutritional quality of them, I'm not an expert on that. What I can tell you is that the trend, just like the other trends sort of discussed here, have become quite explosive. They're often co-opted by the same industries and organizations, so it's quite common to see these terms sort of layered on top of each other. So you get the organic textured vegetable protein that's also fair trade, made in California, though, where fair trade conditions aren't actually part of the narrative. So, again, I think the moral of the story is good reading goes a long way. I was a vegetarian for one point in my life and found that food didn't quite satisfy my craving for meat. But a lot of people look to that food as a alternative for the taste of meat. So some of it is anchored more toward the get your meat fix, and some of it is anchored more toward the get your ethical fix. Groups like Morningstar Farms have played the get your meat fix quite strongly. So if you go to the stores, you'll see things like riblets soaked in barbecue sauce, and they're actually made of like soy. They taste kind of sort of like a pork barbecue rib, but they're not, right? And they've got some kind of like plastic polymer rib holding it all together. But so.
I'm delighted to see the return of the nose to tail trend in taste, which seems to be happening now, but very difficult to get pieces of meat that are not a rib or a chop.
Yeah.
What happens to those organ meats or other kinds of meats when they're not purchased by consumers?
Well, it depends. I mean, I can tell you that in BC that stuff is not taken up quite as often as it is. And I was out in Quebec last year where nose to tail eating is done with quite a joie de vivre that you don't see in this part of Canada. A lot of it is used. A lot of it actually does make its way into ground chuck. So it's good to ask your butcher, what they're making their ground chuck from. And some of it is actually then disposed of, but the stuff that actually can't be, used. Yep.
So a couple of things. In regards to the nose to tail, it's quite culturally active here across Canada, especially in Asian culture and traditional Jewish cooking.
Mm-hmm.
Uses it quite a bit. And I wanted to see what you thought about the issue of globalization in trade, because China is the largest producer of apples
Right.
globally. And I do want to take one poke at you. We have really good tap water in BC.
This is. I did not purchase this. This was given to me. I am a fan of BC tap water. I believe this is probably actually BC tap water filled into the bottle. So I will pass those comments along. But your first point, sorry, I was distracted by the poke, was on nose to tail eating in sort of regionally within BC, and I can speak at least for my own sort of Jewish background that nose to tail eating was just, it wasn't thought of as trendy. It was thought of as just sort of the way that we ate. It was the original food economy, right? It was sort of the original way to be industrious with your food was to get the most out of it. That has kind of varied and changed over time as we've gotten more accustomed to getting our food in packages that don't actually look like what the food initially was in the first place. It's quite easy now to go to the store and get chocolate chip cookies in a log, or ground chuck in some sort of package, or even mold it into a hamburger for you because we just can't make the press ourselves. So we've gotten. The economy has moved away from economy of the material to economy of time. And part of that is because we're working more. There are a few SFU labor geographers who will regale you with statistics about how Canadians are working more but getting paid less. And part of that factors right into the way we eat. Dinner is not our first priority. Our first priority is the multiplicity of other things that are happening before dinner, getting out the door. But I think you're right. Part of it now seems to be with an added sort of trendiness. And that's great. Whatever it takes to make these policies and ideas current and viable and interesting and evocative again is great. But I think there are probably folks in the audience who go, I remember nose to tail eating when it was just called the Great Depression, right? So I understand that too. So yeah.
I'm curious about some of the extent of some of your criticisms. So you sort of laid out
Right.
are pleasing to us, and thus,
Yeah.
we buy it. But in fact, perhaps it is fairly legitimate. We are buying something that is local and
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, I talked to my mother this morning, who is an ardent Whole Foods evangelist. Loves it, and was deeply saddened to know that I was going to be giving a talk that would, speak ill of her favorite place to get groceries. Because where she lives, that is the best place to get groceries. And as Michael Pollan notes in a lot of his writing, sometimes Whole Foods fills a gap that other places don't serve. But not here. In fact, often not where Whole Foods is. Is Whole Foods doing any kind of social justice work for those of us who actually spend some time to look at what we're actually buying? I don't think that Whole Foods is to be maligned for trying to make a profit. They're no different than any number of other companies who peddle in the good taste of greenwashing, eco-washing. Certainly British Petroleum engaged in this post Gulfwater Horizon. We're still buying gas. So it's not a question of down with Whole Foods. It's a question of what are we doing as consumers when we go into those stores? Do we know what we're getting? Do we recognize that we're just buying a story? And that's totally okay. I love good stories, and sometimes that story is quick, convenient, and catchy, and I'm going to buy it. But there are other times when, I got to feed a family, and that story is just not going to cut it. I need to make my dollars go a little bit further.
Can I just follow up
Yeah.
on that just quickly? Also, you sort of told us a little bit about organic certification, for example. Are you saying that you think it's illegitimate that it's third-party certified as opposed to being done by the federal government?
Well, while I think it's really tempting, particularly under this federal government, to question how much more you want to put into their portfolio, not sure that I trust them to oversee farms. At the same time, one of the major issues with organic certification for Canadians is that we accept U.S. certification at par. So I don't really have much of a problem with the way we do it in Canada. We actually do it quite well. The problem is that we don't do a whole lot of it in Canada. We do most of it in the U.S. and buy it in Canada. So the question really isn't the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which does the work on the Canadian side. The question is the marketing services of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that fob it off onto a whole massive enterprise that does, in fact, make a lot of money and has made it relatively difficult for small farmers to gain the organic certification year after year after year. Yep.
I just want to make 2 points and then your thoughts on it. One is I can't help but feel that this whole thing, Whole Foods and this organic, it's just a new level of classism in the way we eat.
Yeah.
It's this sort of bourgeois, lucky to be able to do it kind of thing. So in a time and place when most of us can afford an apple in the winter or a chicken, we've just found a new way of making a chicken or an apple something not affordable except for the top 1% or something like that.
Right.
And your thoughts on that. And then the second thing is this whole it seems this whole preoccupation. Say the word.
Preoccupation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
With organic or natural and stuff, when really, if we want to take care of ourselves, it's always been about calorie
in and calorie out.
intake
Yeah.
and how active we are. We've become a sedentary lifestyle. So I've got a friend, for example, that just will only eat organic, but is still sitting 50 pounds overweight because he doesn't do a shred of exercise in a month.
Yeah.
So it's just sort of interesting how.
Yeah. I think that my dad always used to say calories in, calories out, right? Or he would also follow that one with eat right, exercise, die anyway. But ultimately, what we've done is we've sort of shifted responsibility from us as people who actually are in control of our body. We bipeds who can get up and run or bike or jog or whatever to companies. We've foisted it off onto companies for an upcharge to do the healthy work for us, to sell us better peanut butter, better mayonnaise, better sugar, better sweeteners. Well, it has no calories in it, so it's like I didn't actually have any calories today, so I don't actually have to work out. And in fact, we've become more sedentary. This is not shocking news. I'm sure most of you realize this. We've become more sedentary as a general population, and we're eating the same amount of calories. It's not like we're actually consuming more food. We're consuming the same amount of food and working out less. And at the same time, we've been able to, over the last couple of decades, position that authority over our bodies onto companies to sell us healthier products that will allow us to sit in front of computers, go to the movies, sit at lectures, whatever. So everyone just stand up and jog. So yeah, I think that's totally true. And classism, yeah, I mean, I think that is just sort of, that's the big rub for me with all of this stuff. I have no problem with buying better stuff and paying more for it. I actually don't even have a problem with buying crappy stuff and paying the same for it. If you want to do that, be my guest. But we shouldn't allow ourselves to feel as if we're buying a certain degree of social power or social currency because we're buying the same exact thing wrapped up differently. That to me seems disingenuous. That to me seems actually quite problematic. It's become incredibly stratified. It's become incredibly political, and I think incredibly destructive to the way we think about how food is accessed throughout the city. There are actually some good foods out there that we should be prioritizing to the mainstream, and there are other choices like a natural naked juice that maybe we don't need to spend $6.50 on or $5.99 or whatever it's going for. So yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the story that no, I guess is the quick answer, right? No is the short answer. Yes, and I think in some sort of longer answer, I think the story is that as consumers, we can buy and sort of vote with our pocketbooks is sort of how the story goes. But I think that's only half the story. We sort of make decisions within a path-dependent model. I don't go to the supermarket and say, you know what I'd really like? I'd like sort of half crunchy, half creamy, half almond, 1/4 peanut, 1/4 cashew butter. Doesn't happen, right? I pick from the 40,000 SKUs that are available in my local supermarket. That's on average. In the United States, just in case you're curious, it's about 110,000. So we make about 40,000 choices when we go into a grocery store. I don't get to pick from what's not already there. What's already there is predicated on what we've already made marketable and viable and successful. So there's an argument to be made that we should not buy the junky stuff that's out there. But companies don't necessarily have our best interests at heart. But that doesn't really actually stick in my craw as much as the fact that government doesn't have our best interest at heart. And I can't expect that PepsiCo will really have our best interest at heart. Certainly they have this good-for-you portfolio, but they're not selling Tropicana juice or oatmeal bars because it's good for us. They're selling it because we're buying it. The minute we stop buying it, they're not going to be selling it. So their growing good-for-you portfolio grows as long as that food trend continues. But my beef is more with the fact that we have relatively spineless policy on both sides of the 49th parallel that have fetishized free market economics to the point that we don't really know what we're buying. Things that seem quasi-healthy are actually pretty junky.
You spoke quite largely about free trade in developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts of let's say the fruit pickers and the other people that are brought in, specifically in our Fraser Valley,
Mm-hmm.
and paid low wages and not really housed that well? And,
Yeah.
is there any regulations by the government, any government, to look at this problem?
No, well, and this is funny. So I started my undergraduate research looking at this stuff. My parents live just to the west of Immokalee, Florida, where most of the tomatoes for your Taco Bell burritos end up. And for the longest time, Taco Bell was sort of the face of terrible labor practices on a seasonal migrant worker population. In BC and Alberta, the migrant worker population is incredibly seasonal. They're brought in on a seasonal migrant worker visa scheme that has them come in and come out. But in the U.S., that visa program doesn't exist. They come in, they sort of live these sort of clandestine shadow lives and set up lives that don't have access to social services, don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to education, and live in sort of a constant and persistent fear of government. We're fortunate right now, but we say this on the eves of the possibility of Bill C-31, which will drastically change the face of immigration in Canada. Right now we don't live with the persistent worry and threat of CBSA agents encroaching into our workplaces, into our homes, into our schools and hospitals, looking for undocumented migrants for deportation. And part of that has been a question of economics. For the longest time, Canada hasn't known where they all are and hasn't really felt like it could afford to deport everyone that it had in its midst. The United States is a different example. Plenty of planes, plenty of guns, plenty of troops, a huge Customs and Border Enforcement agency standing guard and ready to make examples out of migrant workers. So for the time being in Canada, they live precariously. I think they live more dangerously and more precariously in the future if Bill C-31 continues to progress through the House as it looks to, where we in Canada will then be harmonizing our border security practices much closer to the United States, and in a way, I think, rendering those seasonal workers not just in a sort of a limbo status, in a limbo position with no language services, no healthcare services, limited access to any kind of social services or social support, transportation, healthcare, you name it, but a situation that will much more closely mirror that in the United States. So we don't ever want to mirror the United States. So, yeah.
You showed a map of McDonald's being a former, in a country,
Yeah, Middle East. Yeah.
It was the Middle East.
Yeah.
I thought it was the Middle East, and then
I don't remember specifically where, and despite being a geography student, my geography is not that good. Yeah.
it was there for a few years, and then
Yeah, and I was in, and I don't think it's on this map, but I was in Vietnam a few years ago, and there was, in fact, McDonald's for a period in Vietnam, but then, again, no longer McDonald's. KFC is quite successful in Ho Chi Minh City, but there is no McDonald's still in Vietnam. And that's sort of the case in certain parts of the world where places, whether it's McDonald's or KFC, open and close depending on the politics of the moment. So, yeah. Yep.
What's your take on genetically modified foods?
Yeah, I was waiting for that question. I knew that was going to. Well, it's again, I think, a question of truth in advertising, right? Unfortunately, most of the food we eat comes from two major seed companies, Monsanto and Cargill. They're actually the folks behind most of that corn that you see in the U.S. And curiously enough, if you've ever gone to McDonald's and gotten one of those Egg McMuffins and wondered how they get the egg yolk perfectly in the... That's Cargill. They figured out the powdered egg substrate that they could then ship all over the world to make sure that your Egg McMuffin was the same wherever you got it. Genetically modified food has been happening for a long time. We just haven't called it genetically modified food. Some genetically modifications are good and good for us. And actually, some organic food has some genetic modification to it. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that just because it's fair trade or organic doesn't mean that it's not been genetically modified. And I think another question that we need to be asking is, what are we modifying it for and against? Are we modifying it for or against pests? Are we modifying it for or against, bigness and size? The one that really sort of gives me the willies is genetically modified chickens, which is what's happening. Most of the chicken that you get in North America comes from Tyson. They are the exclusive provider of chicken to Wendy's, to Burger King, and to McDonald's. So a chicken that you buy from one basically is, molecularly like any other chicken that you got at any of the other fast food restaurants. They've genetically modified their chickens to grow in a third of the time that they used to grow in. So we can move those chickens to market quicker and quicker and quicker. I have an ethical problem with that because it just gives me a real bad taste in my mouth. I can't give you a more sort of academic reasoned argument for why the idea of chicken that used to take 100 days to grow, now taking a month to grow before it's sent to slaughter is just sort of gross. But it just seems sort of gross. And I think a little bit of an ick factor is probably reasonable after as a way back into being critical about the way we eat. I don't think we have to know necessarily how all of these things are affecting our body or why we don't like them, as much as we need to know if and when we're going to make these decisions for ourselves, rather than have these decisions made or foisted upon us because the market thinks that they're viable. Any more? Yep.
Genetically modified food has not been in existence for a long time. It started in 1974. 98% of genetically modified food has been modified to resist herbicide. The chicken, that's the only reason. The chicken is like an anomalous kind of thing. Certified organic food in Canada cannot contain any genetically modified ingredients.
There you go. Great. Yep.
There was a movement a few years back towards irradiation of food,
Mm-hmm.
and there was quite a protest against it. What's happened to that since then?
I don't know. I'm not sure what the latest on that is. Again, from a production side, it's not something that I'm super familiar with, but I'm fairly confident that someone in the audience might have more to say about it than me. But again, I think that the tenor or the scope behind that debate, much like the debate around organic and natural and ethical, is a question about knowing what we're getting. We want to be more involved in the intimate details of the production process, and that I think doesn't mean that we need to go producing the food ourselves, which I think is often and wonderful, very commonly the case in Vancouver. If you can raise chickens in your backyard, be my guest. But we just ought to know a little bit more about what we're buying. We don't actually have to go out and create it ourselves. Yep.
You said a little while ago that we're eating the same amount but exercising less, but do you really think that's true in a lot of cases? Because hasn't it been documented that serving sizes have got quite a bit larger?
Serving sizes have gone up. We've also started taking in a lot of reduced calorie or low sugar or no added sugar. The problem with all of those appellations and distinctions of quasi-diet foods in bigger portions is that once you start lowering the calories, you start adding other stuff like salt. Carbohydrates is sort of the big one. We're eating way more starches today than we were eating, just a decade ago. So even if we try to lower the calories, and we've kept those pretty much at bay for a while, we're still finding other ways to add up the bad count. Yep.
What's your take on farm fish versus the wild fish?
Farm fish versus wild fish. Wow. Well, I mean, it's certainly. I mean, it's a complex issue, and I'm not an expert on commercial fishing. I taught a political ecology course last term at SFU, and we spent a week talking about this, and I feel like it's sort of disingenuous to tell you that I'm by any means an expert on it. And we had folks come in who are working in the farm fisheries. As far as they're concerned, they're not encroaching upon the wild stock or the wild supply. Then we had folks come in from DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and we had folks come in from wild fisheries who were saying, well, we're providing something that's healthy, that's natural, that's not been injected with beta-carotene, and you actually get more beta-carotene out of a piece of farm salmon than most carrots, just because of the way that we've injected them with so much orange color. I don't have a particularly strong opinion, and I think much to the question that I was asked before, what's your opinion on this? I'm sort of sorry to say that I don't have this sort of clear, pin me over here in this corner stand on any of the issues. My encouragement today is more to get us to think sort of provocatively about the choices we're making. I don't personally, want to espouse a value about one or the other, but rather just encourage people to think about how those labels add up and amalgamate into making something on our table. What are all the words that we're basically throwing down on the dinner table? Which of them do we think are worth it? Which of them align with our ethics, with our nutrition, with our sense of wellness, with our sense of self? But in terms of sort of espousing a stock answer, I don't have one. Sorry. Maybe one more question? Yeah? Yeah? Or not? Great, thank you. Yeah.